we're going to get started. As usual, this is being recorded, and I will post the recording to the YouTube channel, and the replay link will be in the Discord here under Town Hall Replays. So, all right, so I know there's a lot of information about NAD and NMN out there. Some of it accurate, some of it not accurate. I wanted to come in and talk about this because this is something I get questioned on all the time. My personal experiences, I've taken both NAD and NMN. I took NAD for about 90 days a couple years ago. I forget what product it was, probably irrelevant. It was third-party tested, met all the things in, the Know Your Supplement talk. And I saw absolutely no difference in any of the subjective or objective markers that I pay attention to. So a couple years later, about 6 or 7 months ago, I had a friend who was like, dude, you got to try this NMN brand. He's a doctorate in pharmacology. So I was like, all right, I'll give this a shot. Was on it for about 30 days, and I had to stop because I saw a tremendous decline in my sleep quality when I was on it. And so that was like my 2 experiments with these things. So I have tried to take them. For me personally, I saw no subjective or objective benefit. In fact, for the NMN, I saw harm when I took it. But why is NAD important? Why are we talking about NAD and NMN? NAD and NADH, which is its counterpart, are involved in what we call redox reactions. So these are about moving electrons to and from things. And that's very important in how we generate energy in our mitochondria. And one of the main things that happens as we get older is that you can see a change in the NAD to NADH ratio. And this change is associated with an increase in oxidative stress, so an increase in markers of cell damage. And so we know that when you lower the ratio, what happens is it limits something called acetyl-CoA, which is very important for generating energy into the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. So that's part of the story. We also know that the NAD and NADH ratio is involved in signaling. So it's a cell signal, and that could be for energy stores or it can be for metabolism. We also know that it's involved and adjacent to SIRT1, which is a longevity signal. It's involved with longevity and what we call senescence, or you may have heard that term regarding zombie cells. So because this ratio gets off as we decline, one of the things that people said, or it gets off as we get older, is one of the things that people said was, well, maybe if we start replacing NAD, then we can see some of the changes associated with aging decline. And then a lot of people will take it for energy. And so I don't really care what rat studies say. I'm not going to talk about the rat studies because we're not rats. I go for what do human studies actually show on this stuff. So this is one of the first studies that I read because, one of the things you think about, okay, if it's involved with metabolism, then taking this could be something that you could see involved with glucose and lipid metabolism, improvements in glucose and lipid metabolism. Oh, I'm breaking up. Okay. That may just be because I'm trying to move between these 2 different things here. And hopefully y'all can still hear me. And hopefully the replay will come out okay. But so this was a meta-analysis looking at NAD and NAD precursors on glucose and lipid metabolism. And so there's the precursors are things like NR, NMN. There's been a lot of these over the years. The most popular are now NR and NMN. But they found that these precursors could improve triglycerides, total cholesterol, LDL, and HDL levels in humans. But there was an increase in hyperglycemia, and that could be concerning. So one of the things I tell people that if you are taking these things, especially within the first 1 to 3 months after you start taking it, go get your blood sugars checked because it can increase blood glucose in some people. when they did a subgroup analysis, and I'll talk more about subgroups later on, they found that there was little effect of these things on people who were healthy. So it seems to be for lipid metabolism that it did not improve those markers that I talked about, triglycerides, total cholesterol, LDL, and HDL, in people who were healthy, who had normal levels. So that's something that possibly a population that may benefit from this if you have elevated triglycerides or cholesterol or LDL and you want to start taking this. I think that's appropriate just because there is human evidence that shows that it can improve those markers, but you really want to be careful and check your blood glucose. And if your level's are already normal, then it's probably not any benefit for you. That's what the subgroup analysis showed. Okay, this study was done recently. It kind of got some publicity because they said, well, okay, NMN showed a couple things in this study. Number one, it did show that it increased blood levels of NAD. That's important because it has to get to the site of action to work, and it does so through the blood. But whether oral supplementation with NAD or NMN reaches the skeletal muscle, which is kind of where the most important action, well, not most important, we would say the most relevant site of action is skeletal muscle. The data shows it's mixed on whether it increases intracellular levels or levels inside of the muscle. So this study, they did a 6-minute walk test, which if you're not familiar with that, you basically walk somebody around for 6 minutes and you can check their time, the time it takes to complete a certain distance, or, fatigue levels at the end. We do this clinically as a test to measure if someone needs oxygen or not, whether they leave the hospital. So it's really not a test of any type of measure that I would really consider for performance. And what they did find was that they did see that people did improve their 6-minute walk test time. Again, that to me is not very clinically relevant. They did also see some improvement in some markers for biological clocks. So biological clocks are like the epigenetic age. There are issues with biological clocks. You can basically cook the books. Like if you do some really healthy stuff before you measure, you'll see a change. If you do some really unhealthy stuff before you measure, you can see a change. And so we still haven't found, like, as far as I think about it, like a perfect biological clock. There's still a lot of work being done on that. And the findings were statistically significant, but to me, they weren't clinically significant. So this was a study that got a lot of media attention, a lot of attention from people. But to me, the findings aren't very clinically significant. Like, for the reasons I mentioned. Number one, I'm not sold on a lot of these biological clocks that are out there. There are problems with those. And number two, increasing a 6-minute walk test is of no clinical significance for me. It's not even a performance metric that we would use for anything that we're actually trying to measure performance for. Like I said, we use it to see if people need oxygen when they leave the hospital or not. So this was a review article that looked at the clinical evidence for NAD supplementation. And they looked at, I believe this was published in 2020. I think this is when this was published. They looked at 36 trials, human trials on NAD, and they found that only 2 of them were adequately powered. And what power means is it's a statistical measurement for if you have the ability to detect if something was due to an intervention or due to random chance. So if you're not adequately powered, it means that the results cannot be determined to be due to the intervention. It could just be due to random chance. So that's really big in the clinical literature. If you do not have an adequately powered trial, those results could be due to chance. They did see that they talked about a couple studies, the one for progression of type 1 diabetes. It didn't show any benefit. They did talk about some studies with NAD infusions for Parkinson's, which did show some benefit. There was little reporting on human side effects, but overall, all of my literature review that there hasn't seemed to be very bad side effects. Again, the major one I've seen is hyperglycemia. And in some people, there is reports of like flushing. That's more with like niacin, which is where we make our NAD from anyway. But overall, it seems to be pretty safe and well tolerated. So my takeaway from this study is that, we're still trying to figure out what groups of people may be the most that can benefit from NAD. Is it healthy people? Is it people with certain disease states? There's still a lot more work that needs to be done in that area, in my opinion, anyway. Okay, so this was the conclusions from that trial, and I'll read it here. It says, based on the human trials conducted to date, and like I said, I believe this was done in 2020. NAD pharmacology is a promising treatment strategy that is safe for human use. However, despite several decades of active investigation, there is still only suggestive evidence in the form of few successful and sufficiently powered clinical trials for NAD upregulation to be effective for any of the many potential indications where it may benefit patients. And so this is why we can't just rely on rat studies. There's a lot of problems with extrapolating information from rat studies or mechanistic studies to actual human outcomes. And this is why we need placebo-controlled trials. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And then our next session, we're going to talk about the placebo and the belief effects. So when people ask me, okay, what's the best thing I can do to increase NAD? I've heard about it. I heard it's great. I want to try something. And this was a study that was published recently, about a year ago, that examined the effects of exercise on age-related decline in skeletal muscle. And they looked at NAD content. And they found that exercise increases muscle NAD in both the young and the old. And that's really relevant. Whenever you see something like this where you can increase something in both a young population and an old population, that's important. And they found that one study found that exercise over long term increases muscle NAD by 127% and NADH by 99%. And this is far greater than what they found in the studies was supplementation increased muscle NAD. So my takeaway from this study is that if you really want to increase your NAD in the best evidence-based way, routine exercise. And again, routine exercise is one of the best things we can do for our overall health, our skeletal health, our metabolic health, period. But it's a very potent strategy for increasing intramuscular, intracellular, where we want the NAD to be. Okay, so people ask me all the time about NAD infusions. And this was a study published in 2019 where they looked at infusing NAD continuously. And what they wanted to look at was NAD metabolites in the urine and NAD blood levels. And what they found was that after about 2 hours is when it would take for the NAD to show up in the blood. So you had to continuously infuse it for 2 hours for it to show up in the blood. And their hypothesis was that either, and I wish they had checked this, I wish they had checked intramuscular NAD with the infusion, was either that it was being rapidly taken in by the cells or it was being rapidly cleared in the plasma. And so it took they saw after 2 hours that it would start to increase in the blood, and they did it for 6 hours. And then after they shut the infusion off after 6 hours, then the NAD levels would rapidly decline. So I couldn't find any evidence that looked at IV NAD and what happens to intramuscular or intracellular NAD levels, because again, that's really what you want to see. So based on the cost of these things and then the limited evidence of benefit for, most of the conditions like we talked about, IV therapy is not something that I recommend. So this brings us kind of to our conclusion here. Is NMN a solution for longevity and all this other stuff? It remains to be seen. Like, my take on it is, if you have all your other bases covered, all the other stuff we talked about, your exercise, sleep, nutrition, all that stuff, you've got your basic supplementation covered, making sure that you're supplementing for your dietary patterns. If you don't eat a lot of fatty or oily fish, that you're taking some fish oil. Maybe you don't eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and you may benefit from a greens powder. Or you don't eat a lot of whole foods and then you could benefit from magnesium supplementation. The things that we kind of talk about, multivitamin, like the stuff that has good evidence for it, and also helps correct an issue in like your dietary plan. If you have all of that stuff covered, then okay, maybe you can try NAD and NMN. I don't think we have good evidence so far as to what subgroups may be the ones who are most likely to benefit. Is it people with certain genetic mutations? Is it people who have certain disease states? Is it certain ethnicities or certain ages? That remains to be seen, right? Is the effects that people keep harping on about, is it actually true or is it placebo? And we're going to talk about placebo and belief effects, but placebo and belief effects can be tremendously powerful. We're going to talk about some studies that show how powerful these things actually are. But the reason we have to have placebo-controlled trials is because we know how powerful placebo is. In fact, I saw an ad for, I think it was a migraine medication, and it talked about whatever the clinical endpoint was, and usually for migraines, it's a reduction in symptom days, that 42% of people in the placebo arm met the same endpoint as people in the drug arm. Like 64, 66, whatever it was, percent of people in the drug arm met the clinical endpoint. 42% in the placebo arm met the clinical endpoint. So that's almost half the people on placebo had the same effect as the clinical drug. So we have to keep that in mind, is, are we just getting an expensive placebo or belief effect? Because a lot of these supplements, the IV stuff, is not cheap. I talked about the subgroups. We still haven't identified if there is a subgroup or if there's not a subgroup that may benefit from this. And I think that's an area that we can further expand on and do more research on. Because I'll be the first person to come on here and say, hey, if this study shows that this subgroup benefits from it, boom, this is a subgroup that should take it. The other thing, again, is if you are someone who really keeps track of your stuff and monitors your behaviors, has a pretty good idea of how different things affect you, and you do start taking it, take it in a place where you're not changing anything else. Right? Try to make it as much of a controlled experiment as you possibly can. So whenever I start a new supplement, I try to hold as much consistent as I possibly can, and then I'll start trying to take it. I guess the final point here is, based upon the literature in humans, I don't think there's substantial risk of harm. So people are like, well, is it going to harm me? I'm like, probably not. As long as you check your blood glucose, that seems to be the main thing. I just don't know if it's going to help you. And I just don't know if you're getting a real effect from taking it, or, like I said, a placebo or a belief effect. So that's kind of where I stand on it at the moment. I'm still looking for literature and studies, human studies on this. I'd be really interested if anybody knows of or has heard of any IV studies that look at, does it increase intramuscular NAD? There are some studies that show increases in other athletic performance markers that I care about. And some people, other studies show no difference in those athletic markers. So it's figuring out, well, which subgroup of people would benefit from this in regards to those athletic markers. So that's where I think we are on the subject. I know other people have various opinions. Some people are more willing to jump on stuff because, hey, it shows it does all this in rats. Cool. Does it increase human longevity? I have no idea. May it? Yeah, I don't know. Human longevity is really, really hard to do because you need a long period of time to measure that particular thing. So I'll open up the floor to any questions that you guys may have. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and we'll be back in I think 2 weeks for the placebo and belief effect talk. Y'all have a blessed evening.